In my past life, I diligently avoided all encounters with Mia. When she transferred her job to the West, I applied to Southwest University. She bought a house and prepared for marriage in the West. I decided to settle in the North. In my previous life, Mia's dedication to her lifelong love, Parker, led her to live a solitary life, because she felt indebted to him. They secretly adopted a child together. Even my own daughter Olivia was moved by their pure love, and ended up becoming family with them. After, I managed to reclaim our marriage certificate at the last moment, but no one knew I had been reborn just moments before. As soon as I retrieved that certificate, I rushed to the office, using a clerical error as an excuse to get it back. The secretary was surprised, wondering if I had changed my mind about getting married. I simply shook my head, saying the information was filled out incorrectly, and that I would return it after corrections. The secretary sighed in relief, asking me to bring it back soon. I nodded, stepped outside, and threw the marriage certificate into the trash. In this life, Mia and I could no longer marry. Previously, even after filing for marriage, her attitude toward me grew colder. I thought it was just her nature and I didn't pay much attention. Little did I know, as my life was nearing its end, my own daughter carelessly revealed that, in the end, she and Uncle had found their happily ever after. I would have remained in the dark if not for those final moments. This life was just a cruel joke. Mia's coolness toward me, her frequent transfers, they all had a reason. None other than Parker. Whenever I looked at our old house with mixed feelings, a place where, in my previous life, Mia and I were supposed to have our wedding. A month after our wedding, she was transferred to the West. I wanted to follow, but she insisted the conditions were too harsh and advised me to stay behind. For 30 years I lived here, never realizing that less than 6 months after her transfer, Parker had followed her. From that moment on, their lives became entwined forever. It's ironic, isn't it? I worried about Mia, worried that she was alone with no one to care for her. I wanted to be with her, but she always refused. And all the while, she had Parker, a confidant, a man who truly understood her. And I spent my entire life here because of her, never leaving this land. When I finally came home, Mia was not yet back. I went to the room, opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet, and found it. My acceptance letter from my previous life. After we married, Mia was transferred west, and my mother-in-law fainted for no reason a month later. Someone had to stay to take care of the house. I gave up my chance to study in the Southwest, a regret that haunted me from my previous life. I caressed the letter, my name standing out in the bright red lettering of the university. For the first time in both lives, I almost cried. In my previous life, as I was nearing death, Parker and my daughter visited me. They seemed aware that my time was short. Parker came daily, and when alone, he revealed his true feelings. His words cut deeply, mocking my entire existence. Throughout Mia's life, it was I who stood by her side. Not you. I was nothing, he claimed. Nothing more than a free nanny, someone who only existed to care for the elderly and children. And the worst part? I lacked the strength to argue. I could only watch as my own daughter treated him like a father. And as I drew my last breath, she sighed in relief, whispering, "Uncle has finally fulfilled his wish." I carefully stored away the acceptance letter from my past. As I prepared dinner, Mia returned home, exhausted and drenched. I remembered this day from my past life. Knowing Mia had filed the marriage certificate, I had bought a lot of food to celebrate with her. She returned very late, soaked to the bone. I had been worried, asking what happened, but Mia had only offered cold indifference. No explanation. No warmth. Only later did I learn the truth. That Parker, for reasons unknown, had fallen into the river. And Mia had saved him. I bitterly laughed, recalling how I had guessed that Parker might have known about Mia's marriage filing and, in desperation, attempted suicide. This also explained why Mia was so cold towards me that day. Perhaps she blamed me for Parker's drastic actions. But I was not to blame. She was the one who wanted to marry. She was the one who filed the marriage certificate. She was the one who promised to be with me forever. Yet, in the end, I was cast as the villain, the one destroying their tragic love. So when I saw Mia drenched again, unlike my past life, where I would have rushed to care for her, I calmly continued cooking. She had no hot water for a shower but said nothing, quietly changing her wet clothes. During dinner, she sneezed continuously, but I pretended not to hear. After dinner, as I washed the dishes, I noticed Mia pacing restlessly in the living room. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her coat and hurriedly announced she'd be out for a while before rushing out the door. I pursed my lips, marking a cross on the old, yellowing poster on the wall. Just one more mark and I would leave this place. Mia returned near dawn. From the next room, I heard her deliberately soft footsteps, but I acted as if I knew nothing. The next morning, assuming Mia had gone to work, I prepared to buy a train ticket. Then I heard coughing from her room. My hand paused, holding the bowl, but I continued as if I hadn't heard. After finishing my meal, I planned to go out to buy the ticket. At this time of year, tickets were hard to get, requiring a long wait in line. But this ticket was crucial for me. I needed to buy it early to feel secure. Just as I was about to leave, I heard knocking at the door. Opening it, I saw a pale-faced, nervous Parker standing outside. He glanced at me quickly, then looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, I'm looking for Mia." Anyone seeing him would assume the worst, would think there was something unsavory between them. But I had no time for his drama. I didn't close the door. I simply walked past him and down the stairs. At the store, I bought rice and biked out, stopping to ask a few more people along the way. By nearly 10 a.m., I reached the train station, which was unusually busy. The lines were long, but I chose the shorter one. By noon, as the staff prepared for their break, it was finally my turn. But seats to my destination were sold out. Without hesitation, I bought the earliest standing ticket available, carefully hid the train ticket on me, and hurriedly biked back home. I was apprehensive that, upon returning home, I would find the troubled couple sharing a tender moment. But instead, I found Mia sitting alone in the living room. Her door was conspicuously wide open. As she saw me, Mia seemed to want to speak but hesitated. I simply turned and headed into the kitchen, feeling hungry and opting to make dinner. Throughout the meal, I sensed Mia wanted to explain something, but I remained silent. And she reluctantly held back. Eventually, she looked up at me. "Ethan, just eat your dinner. No talking." I cut her off casually, echoing her own words from the past. Mia choked back her words and I smirked inwardly. Previously, it was always me who initiated conversations. But whenever I faced certain topics, she would deliberately disengage or simply say, "Don't talk while eating." At first, I thought I wasn't articulate enough. But later, I realized that speaking to the wrong person is always a mistake. Whatever she wanted to say, I no longer cared. After dinner, I went to my room and gathered the wedding gifts I had prepared for our would-be marriage. I packed everything into a large bag. My cousin was getting married later in the year, and since his financial situation wasn't great, it would be a shame to waste these expensive items. I stuffed all the clothes into an old sack and quietly prepared to deliver them to my cousin the next day. Once Mia left the house, I carried the sack to my mother's house. She thought Mia and I had argued and worried it might affect my university studies. I temporarily concealed the truth, claiming I needed to buy new clothes and had no place to store the old ones, so I was bringing them home early. My mother finally sighed in relief. If my mother knew I intended to cancel the wedding with Mia, she might chase me down the street. Both our parents worked at the same state-owned enterprise, and Mia and I had known each other since childhood. Mia had always been the bright one with a good job and striking looks. My mother really liked her, and when a matchmaker proposed us, Mia's parents learned of it and felt we were a good match. Initially, because of Mia's beauty and her successful career, I thought she wouldn't care for someone like me. But a few days later, my mother happily told me that Mia indeed had feelings for me. From then, our relationship rapidly progressed until our families arranged our engagement. A month ago, my mother said, "Mia is such a good wife that finding another like her would be like finding a lantern that shines as brightly as the moon." She urged me to hold on to her or face her wrath. Honestly, being with Mia, I felt quite uncertain. I never imagined she could become my wife. Sometimes I noticed her distant attitude, but I thought it was due to her busy career. Little did I know, Mia had always been torn between me and Parker, perhaps choosing me because I was a suitable match agreed upon by both families. Now, without the marriage certificate, everything between us was effectively over. Leaving the house, I felt a rare sense of relief and leisurely bought an ice cream from a roadside vendor as I strolled home, the cool evening breeze brushing against my face, carrying the scent of street food and the distant hum of a city winding down. But then I caught sight of a man and a woman arguing. "Ian, don't force me. I can't accept this," Parker pleaded in a tender voice, his expression conflicted. Mia, with one hand steering her bicycle, determinedly pushed a bag of rice into his hands, her face set with quiet resolve. "Just take it, Parker," she insisted. "This rice would just waste away with me, but you could live on it for half a year, which makes it more meaningful." They pushed and pulled at the bag, their movements tangled in an all too familiar rhythm, until Parker, noticing me, instinctively moved to block me from approaching Mia. "We really have nothing going on, please don't misunderstand," Parker blurted out, his voice laced with desperation. "I'm not shamelessly clinging to Mia. If you're angry, be angry at me." The man in front of me looked pale, yet his eyes were steady and full of conviction, as if he had accepted his fate. Meanwhile, Mia, the one he instinctively shielded, stood behind him, staring at me with an equally pale, shaken expression. I coldly walked past them, without sparing them a second glance. Not a word. Not a moment of hesitation. Just my luck. Running into the very people I wanted to avoid, even on the street. Not long after, I returned home, shutting the door behind me with quiet finality. The house felt heavier than usual, the air thick with unspoken words. Mia stepped inside as well. For the first time in a long while, her usually emotionless face carried something: hesitation, guilt, or perhaps an emotion even she couldn't name. "Ethan, please listen to me." I glanced at her indifferently, my posture relaxed but my eyes sharp. "Go ahead." Truthfully, I didn't care what she had to say. But seeing that I wasn't furious, that I was still willing to converse, she sighed in relief. "I knew you wouldn't misunderstand." Hearing that, I sneered inwardly. She seemed to be carefully choosing her words, her voice slow and measured, as if testing the waters before stepping in. "Things aren't how they looked." I remained silent, watching her with an unreadable expression, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated, then spoke in a sincere tone, almost pleading. "There was a time I got injured on the way to the hospital. Parker helped me bandage it and took me there. After that, every time I went back for treatment, I happened to run into him again." Her voice was soft, careful. Too careful. "I heard he was struggling financially, so I thought I should help him a little." She observed me closely as she spoke, her eyes scanning my face, gauging my reaction. But I remained silent, offering nothing. No validation, no anger, no warmth. Too many coincidences meant none of it was a coincidence at all. There was no way a grown woman like Mia wouldn't understand what this all meant. She was just playing dumb. So the rice meant for our wedding wasn't as important as giving it to him instead. Though I no longer cared. But I couldn't resist a sarcastic jab. Mia's expression shifted, a flicker of something unfamiliar passing across her face: embarrassment. "That's not what I meant," she muttered, her voice unsteady. She might try to deny it, but deep down she knew the truth. I thought for a moment before speaking, my voice calm, sincere. "Have you ever considered canceling the wedding?" There. I had finally voiced what had been lingering in my mind. If she was the one to propose calling it off, at least my mother wouldn't throw a fit, crying and making a scene. Besides, in my past life, after filing for marriage, Mia had gradually grown distant, perhaps out of regret. If we ended it now, it would be better for both of us. But to my surprise, Mia's brows furrowed in displeasure. "Do you think marriage is a game?" she snapped. "How can we just decide not to get married? I'm a woman. What do you expect people to think of me?" I scoffed inwardly. So that's what it was about. It wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Parker. It was about her reputation. All right, I get it," I said, raising my hands in mock surrender. I had no interest in arguing with her anymore. I turned and headed to my room. Better to spend my time planning stock investments than listening to another lecture. As for money, I had no choice but to use what my parents had given for the wedding. They were so pleased with Mia that they had poured their entire life savings into our upcoming marriage. I opened the safe, took out the money, and carefully wrapped it in a cloth. I couldn't return it now, so I would treat it as my startup capital. If my mother eventually found out and started throwing a fit, I would simply present the money to her. Hopefully, she would be too relieved to stay angry for long. The next morning, the first thing I did was add another mark to the old yellowed poster on the wall. Only 8 more days until I could leave. What are you writing? A deep voice suddenly rang out behind me. I flinched and turned around, my body tensing. Mia stood there watching me curiously. She was close, too close. I could feel her breath against my ear, sending an uncomfortable shiver down my spine. Disgusted, I instinctively stepped back. I was about to brush it off with a lie, but her gaze remained fixed on the poster. I was forced to come up with something. I'm counting the days since you submitted the marriage registration, I said casually, keeping my voice even. For some reason, my words seemed to please her. The doubt and unease on her face instantly faded, replaced by visible relief. She let out a quiet breath and unclenched the hand she had hidden behind her back. In her palm was a small velvet box. Open it, she said, looking at me expectantly. Strange. In my past life, we were married for 50 years. We raised a daughter together. We buried 4 parents. Yet not once did she ever give me a gift. My eyes landed on the box, and for a brief moment I found it ironic. What's wrong? Mia urged again. Go ahead and open it. I took a deep breath and pushed the velvet box back toward her. Keep it, I said calmly. Give it to me after our marriage certificate is approved. Of course, that certificate would never be approved in this lifetime. The corner of my lips curled slightly. Mia looked at the box in her hands and sighed. All right then, she murmured. I'll hold on to it and give it to you once the registration goes through. I could tell she was disappointed. She had clearly put thought into giving me this gift, probably expecting a different reaction. But did it matter? Compared to the lies and pain she had inflicted on me in my past life, this was nothing. After breakfast, Mia prepared to leave. Before heading out, she mentioned that she'd come home early so we could go to the movies together. I neither agreed nor objected, simply watching as she stepped out the door. Once she was gone, I gathered my belongings. I had packed the night before and left a note on the table in the living room, saying I would be visiting my uncle for a few days. By the time I arrived at the neighboring town by bus, it was already close to noon. My uncle and aunt hadn't expected me, so when they saw me walking in with a large bundle, they immediately put down their chopsticks to welcome me. My grandmother, upon seeing me, lit up with joy and pulled me into a warm hug. Truthfully, seeing my grandmother, who had passed away early in my previous life, alive and well filled me with an overwhelming warmth. She only had 2 children and had always favored me more than my cousins. This time, I had brought not only the wedding gifts I had originally prepared, but also various supplements and supplies for her. After a long conversation, my uncle secretly caught a chicken to prepare a special meal for me. I knew better than to protest, so I let him do as he pleased. My aunt, on the other hand, was shocked by how much I had brought with me, momentarily speechless as I unpacked. I chuckled. Mom told me to bring these over. If you want to thank someone, thank her. I knew I'd have to face my mother's wrath when I returned, so what was another debt added to the pile at this point? I had resigned myself to it. Hearing that my mother had sent the gifts, my relatives finally relaxed. Still, my aunt seemed uneasy, mainly because the quantity was excessive, but my grandmother remained unbothered. She waved dismissively, saying, "What's the big deal? A bride leaving home should bring gifts. It's nothing." At my grandmother's house, I lived comfortably. During the day, she would cook all sorts of delicious meals for me. In the evenings, I chatted with my cousin about all kinds of things. My uncle and aunt didn't have stable jobs. My aunt sold roasted sweet potatoes near a factory, while my uncle did odd jobs. One day, I accompanied my aunt to sell sweet potatoes and noticed a nearby stall selling hair accessories. The business seemed to be doing well, so I casually asked my aunt, "Why don't you consider selling additional items like that?" She simply shook her head. "We don't have a supplier for that kind of stuff. Besides, buying stock would require a lot of money, and we'd have to worry about competition. It's not that simple." I silently made a note of it. In my past life, my uncle and aunt had struggled financially, their hair turning gray early from the stress of making ends meet. But they had always treated me with kindness. This time, if I could help them escape poverty, even elevate them to a comfortable life, I would. So, I began casually dropping comments about the profitability of small businesses. Over time, my aunt started paying more attention to the surrounding vendors. Eventually, she hesitantly asked me, could selling accessories really earn more than selling sweet potatoes? I knew then that she was considering it. Now all she needed was an opportunity. If I could find a supplier, she'd likely take the leap. I stayed at my grandmother's house for a full week. I deliberately extended my visit because I knew that once I left for school, seeing them again wouldn't be as easy. During those days, I frequently visited the accessory stall nearby, striking up conversations with the owner and eventually learning where she sourced her products. Then, together with my aunt and cousin, we went to get a batch of inventory to try selling. 2 days later, with everything set in motion, I finally felt at ease and returned home. After putting away the things I had brought back, I flopped onto my bed, letting out a long exhale. When I woke up, it was already dark. As soon as I stepped out of my room, the rich aroma of food filled the air. I was about to call out, but then I saw them. 2 people in the kitchen, chatting and laughing together. Leaning against the doorway, I watched them with an impassive expression. Just then Parker walked out carrying a plate. When he saw me standing there, he let out a startled yelp and dropped the dish, sending it crashing to the floor. Mia rushed over in alarm, but the moment she saw me, her face went pale. For a long moment no one spoke. I finally broke the silence. You two seem to be having a great time. Should I leave you to it? Mia snapped out of her daze and instinctively took a large step back. Meanwhile, Parker stared at me, his eyes filled with defiance. Go home, I said flatly. He clenched his jaw, refusing to move. I chuckled coldly. What? Do I need your permission to be in my own house? At my words, Parker took 2 steps back, his lips trembling. That's not what I meant. Before he could finish, Mia frowned and cut in. What are you saying? Hyun's just here to eat. He's been studying late and had no one to cook for him. Since you weren't home, I figured I wouldn't be able to finish all this food alone, so I invited him over. Stop making a scene. She had unconsciously placed herself between Parker and me, as if shielding him. Without hesitation, I slapped her. Mia froze in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Perhaps she had never expected me to retaliate. Over her shoulder, I caught a glimpse of Parker's lips curling into a smirk, his eyes taunting me. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. Ignoring them both, I turned to the old poster on the wall, picked up a pin, and carefully etched another mark into it. 2 more strokes. Just 2 more, and I'd finally be free of this place and these 2 despicable people. As Parker finally left, Mia glanced at the markings on the poster. She seemed puzzled but couldn't quite put her finger on why. A strange expression flickered across her face, and then she hesitated. Ethan, she murmured. I turned to look at her, my face devoid of emotion. What? She hesitated again before whispering. There's really nothing between me and Parker. I had no interest in hearing any more excuses. I picked up my chopsticks and started eating. Seeing my complete indifference, she fell silent. After dinner, as I sorted through the things I had brought back from my grandmother's house, Mia suddenly spoke again. Ethan, why does it feel like there's less stuff in your room? I didn't respond. You had so many things prepared for the wedding before, she continued, her voice uncertain. I still said nothing. Seemingly flustered, she quickly added, I was thinking, since we've already submitted the marriage registration, we could start decorating the room little by little. You even bought decorative paper and patterns. Hand them over, I'll put them up. I nearly laughed. Decorate? For what? If she wanted decorations, she could go pick some up from my cousin's house. But I didn't want to argue. It's still early, I said indifferently. Let's wait a few days. Hearing that, Mia relaxed, mistaking my words for reassurance. The next morning, she surprised me by preparing breakfast. After we ate, she didn't leave the house. I ignored her and went to the table, calmly drawing another mark on the poster. Only 1 more day left. Tomorrow at 6 a.m. I would be gone. As I carefully made the mark, Mia smiled and said, Don't worry. Our marriage certificate should be approved soon. I didn't even look at her. I simply continued cleaning up the dishes. She still didn't leave. Instead, she turned to me with a bright expression. Since we're getting married soon, Let's go shopping for clothes together. I hesitated. She wasn't wrong. I did need some new clothes for when I left for school. So without a word, I went to my room to get money. Seeing that I didn't refuse, Mia instinctively let out a sigh of relief. But in the end, we never made it to the store. The moment we stepped outside, we saw Parker. He was leaning against the wall, looking like he had been standing there all night. Mia gasped and ran over to him, pushing his shoulder. Parker, what are you doing here? His eyes fluttered open, and when he saw both of us stepping out together, he instinctively stood up. Ethan, I'm sorry about yesterday, he murmured. Then, narrowing his eyes, he suddenly shut them and collapsed toward Mia. Her expression shifted immediately. She instinctively caught him, shaking him frantically. Parker, wake up. Meanwhile, I simply crouched down and pressed my fingers against a pressure point on his upper lip. Parker's body tensed for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to remain limp. I had to give him credit for his dedication. I reached out to press the pressure point on Parker's face once more. Mia hesitated for a brief moment before quickly pushing my hand away. He's malnourished and anemic, she said hastily. I need to take him to the hospital. Without looking back, she helped Parker up and rushed outside. I didn't bother closing the door. Instead, I leisurely followed them to the hospital. When I arrived, Mia was standing anxiously beside Parker's hospital bed, having just finished speaking with the doctor. The moment she turned and saw me, her entire body stiffened in shock. Why are you here? She asked. I ignored her question and turned my attention to Parker, who lay in the hospital bed. He wasn't particularly handsome. If anything, his frail frame and sunken cheeks made him look even more pitiful. Then I looked at Mia. So this was her type? As I stared at her, she instinctively avoided my gaze. I took a step closer and spoke coldly. The day you submitted the marriage registration, he jumped into the river. The moment those words left my mouth, Parker's body trembled under the covers, and even Mia sprang to her feet, knocking over the chair behind her. What did you say? She stammered. I continued, unbothered. The rice meant for our wedding. You gave it to him instead. You said giving it to me was a waste. But for him, it was enough to survive for half a year. And while I was away, and yet you even brought him into our home. Mia opened her mouth, struggling to find the words. I raised a hand, silencing her. Then I turned to Parker, who was still faking unconsciousness. He was obviously pretending to be asleep. And yet you're willing to stay here all night by his side. I didn't believe for a second that Mia was blind to Parker's act. The truth was simple, they both had feelings for each other. If you don't want to get married, you can just say so. But you shouldn't treat me like this. I said it coldly, watching her closely. Hearing the words cancel the wedding, Mia finally panicked. No, I won't cancel it, she blurted out. I glanced at Parker, still lying in bed, still pretending to be unconscious. He had impressive endurance. Perhaps that's how he managed to win Mia over in my past life. I only pity him, Mia continued. He has no family, barely enough food to eat. I just wanted to help him. We're all human. We should look out for one another. Her voice was a little too loud, as if she was trying to convince herself. And at that moment I saw it. The tear that slipped from the corner of Parker's eye. I scoffed. Suit yourself, I said, shaking my head. I'm leaving. I turned toward the door, and as I walked away, I heard Mia's voice behind me. Go ahead first, she said. I'll be home later. I didn't take her words to heart. Instead, I went out and bought 2 new sets of clothes. Then I met up with my parents for dinner. We had a great meal together, and I made sure to take my time. It was late when I finally returned home. Inside, everything that needed to be packed was packed. Everything that needed to be taken away had been taken. But even by 11 p.m., Mia still hadn't returned. That night, I finished writing the letter. A letter exposing Parker's misconduct, addressed to the university administration. It was my parting gift to him. A thank you for staying by my bedside for a few days in my past life. As for Mia, because of the close ties between our families, I had to be more restrained, but canceling the wedding that was inevitable, I documented everything, her actions, her involvement with Parker, And that night I sent the letter. By tomorrow morning my mother would have it in her hands. The next morning after washing up I stood before the old faded poster on my wall. With a steady hand I added the final stroke. Then without looking back I grabbed my suitcase and walked out the door. By the time I reached the train station half the day had passed. It was crowded, bustling with people embarking on their own journeys, and now I was one of them. For the first time I wasn't running in circles, I was moving forward. Epilogue. Mia's perspective. Just like that, Ethan disappeared from my life. His room was empty. He hadn't even left a note. If there was anything left behind, it was only the two characters on that old poster. It was only then that I finally understood he wasn't marking the days. Since I submitted the marriage registration, he was counting down the days until he would leave. Only much later did I learn the full truth. On the very day I filed for marriage, Ethan had already reclaimed the registration. Even the wedding dowry my parents gave him had been left untouched in his home. 3 days later, his parents arrived at my house accompanied by mine. It was then that I realized the depth of his resentment toward Parker. But why couldn't he have given another chance? Ethan had said Parker was faking his illness. How could I not have known that? I had already decided that once Parker was discharged from the hospital, I would cut all ties with him. I wouldn't let Ethan misunderstand anymore. I wouldn't let Parker be the reason for our problems. But Ethan never gave me that chance. He left completely. I begged his parents not to cancel the wedding. I promised I would change, that I would make him reconsider, but they only looked at me with disappointment and shook their heads. I sat alone in his empty room, my hands trembling. This was the place where he had lived, where his presence had once been. On instinct I opened the drawer where he used to keep his things, only to find it empty. That was the moment I collapsed to the floor. He had planned to leave me all along. Later Parker unexpectedly came to find me. His face was full of panic as he told me that someone had reported him to the school, and now he had been expelled. I just stared at him in silence. Then he begged me. He asked if he could stay at my place just for a while. I quietly pushed him out the door. How could I let that happen? Ethan had already left because of Parker. If I had even the slightest involvement with Parker again, then for the rest of my life I would never have another chance with Ethan. Parker was unwilling to accept that. He clung to me, trying to stay in my life, but it was too late. Soon after I was transferred to the West with Ethan and gone, there was no reason for me to stay. I still remember when we were kids, my parents once took me to visit a family. There had been a little boy there a few years younger than me. He followed me everywhere, loved listening to my stories, and would pick wildflowers and give them to me. When I grew older, a matchmaker came to introduce me to a potential husband. I hadn't thought much about marriage at the time, but when I heard the name of the man being introduced to me, I agreed without even knowing why. We fell in love so effortlessly. He became my fiancé, but now all of that was gone. After I was transferred to the West, I wrote letters to him. None of them were ever answered. Once I secretly went to visit him. He had grown taller, more mature. He had friends around him, people who laughed and talked with him. I didn't dare let him see me. Later, when Ethan was about to graduate from university, I quietly bought a house. I thought if he gave me, I wouldn't mind proposing to him myself. I waited for a long time, rehearsing what I would say on the day of his graduation. I brought a bouquet of roses and went to find him, but what I saw was someone else standing beside him. Later, I heard that he had married right after graduating. His wife gave birth to a daughter. I also heard that he made a fortune in the stock market. As for me, my life just drifted by. When I was on my deathbed, I saw a different version of my life. I saw myself and Ethan getting married. I saw us raising a child together, but I also saw Parker. I saw myself in middle age, finally moved by Parker's unwavering devotion. I saw myself agreeing to let him adopt a child. That child called me mother, and Parker remained by my side. I saw Parker standing at Ethan's deathbed whispering cruel words. I wanted to stop him. I reached out my hand, but I couldn't move. The sound of beeping filled my ears. Suddenly I woke up. My mind was in a haze, but in the distance I saw Ethan walking out of the clerk's office, the paper in his hand. Our marriage certificate was tossed into the trash. A sharp pain shot through my chest. I ran after him. I thought this time I could change things. The beeping sound continued to echo, and then everything went dark.